Close your eyes if you like, because this story lives somewhere no eyes work very well anyway. Picture the ocean not as water, but as a great dark building sunk sideways into the world. Up near the roof there is light and warmth, and all the usual business of the sea, fish darting about like commuters who think their commute matters. But go down, go past the first few 100 meters, and the light gives up on you entirely. 90% of that whole vast building, floor after floor after floor, sits in the dark. No candle, no moon, no glow of any kind, save for what the residents make themselves. And residents there are. Some have been down there so long they may as well hold the deed. We are going to wander through that building tonight, floor by floor, slow and easy, and meet a few of the old tenants. There is no need to hurry. Nothing down there is in a hurry either. Evolution. For years, the story people told themselves was a tidy one. The deep sea, they said, sat empty for most of Earth's history. A grand old house with no one home because there was no light and precious little food to fill it. Only later, once flowering plants took hold on land and sent a slow trickle of nourishment down into the ocean, did anyone bother moving into the basement. It is a nice enough story, only it turned out to be a bit premature, the way most tidy stories are. Fossil hunters found faint traces, footprints of a kind, not from feet but from fins and mouths, pressed into ancient rock in Italy, rock that was once the floor of a sea 130 million years gone. Fish had been swimming and feeding down there long before anyone thought the lights were even worth switching on. And there is a further wrinkle to unravel by the fire some evening. Certain deep-sea fish alive today, the holocephalians among them, come from a family line so old it hints at an even earlier arrival, earlier than any fossil has yet confirmed. No proof has surfaced, just a strong suspicion, the kind an old grandmother gets about a neighbor, correct more often than not, and never quite provable either. Later chapters of this story turn up in Canada, in Angola, in the quiet hills of Italy, where an old lakebed of an ancient sea preserved fish that once drifted 300 or 400 meters down in the dark. Denmark has a few. So does Hungary, oddly enough, tucked away from a sea that dried up ages since. Taken all together, the picture is not of some frontier recently settled. It is an old, old house, lived in far longer than anyone first gave it credit for, and the families who moved in early adapted so thoroughly to the place that hardly anyone new has managed to get a foot in the door since. Environment. Let me tell you what that house is actually like, because it is not a gentle place, whatever the quiet suggests. Sunlight only reaches the first couple of 100 meters, what they call the photic zone, where photosynthesis still does its work. Below that, darkness begins in earnest, and by the time you are 90% of the way through the ocean's volume, there is no light left at all, not a flicker. The cold down there rarely lifts above 3 degrees, and can drop near 2 below, cold enough to make the harshest winter you've known feel like a mild evening by comparison. The one exception, and it is a strange one, is the hydrothermal vents, scalding past 350 degrees in spots, as though the ocean kept one radiator running purely out of spite. The pressure builds the further down you go, gently at first, then relentlessly, reaching up toward 1,000 atmospheres in the deepest trenches. Oceanographers, being fond of naming things, have carved the water into layers. The sunlit epipelagic up top. Below that, the mesopelagic, the twilight zone, where a last faint smudge of light still lingers, fading out around 1,000 meters down. Somewhere in that stretch sits a band low on oxygen, and yet curiously rich in nutrients, the ocean's own quiet contradiction. Deeper again lies the Bathypelagic, and deeper still, past 4 kilometers, the Abyssopelagic, both in complete and total darkness. Between the two of them, they make up 3/4 of all the livable space in the sea, 3/4 of the house, and no windows in any of it. So how does anyone eat down there with no sun and no green thing growing? The answer drifts down from above, quiet as falling snow, and that is exactly what they call it. Marine snow. Dead plankton, tiny shells, bits of waste, dust from the world above, clumping together and sinking, slow and unhurried, sometimes taking weeks to reach the bottom. Most of it gets eaten long before it arrives, picked clean by smaller mouths on the way down. But what does survive the journey becomes the whole foundation of life in the deep. A house with no larder of its own, fed entirely by crumbs falling from someone else's kitchen far above. And even in a world with no shape to see by, the residents still know where the good corners are. Certain fish, lanternfish and hatchetfish among them, gather thick around seamounts and the edges of continental slopes, drawn by whatever prey has gathered there first. Even blind, in pitch dark, it seems, everyone still knows where the party is. Characteristics. Now, if you were to move into this house yourself, you would need a few tricks up your sleeve, because the pressure alone would do for you otherwise. The residents solve it simply enough. Their insides push back just as hard as the water pushes in, so nothing gets crushed. But that balance comes at its own quiet cost, because all that internal pressure stiffens up the walls of every cell, the way cold stiffens your knuckles on a bad morning. Less give in the walls means the cells struggle to do their ordinary work, so these fish have learned to loosen the fabric of themselves with softer, more flexible fats, keeping just enough give in the seams to carry on living at all. This is also why you will never see one thriving in an aquarium tank. Bring one up too quickly, and the gas trapped inside its own body, compressed for a whole lifetime under all that weight, expands on the way up faster than the poor creature can manage, and it does not end well for it. With no light worth speaking of, plenty of these fish gave up on eyesight altogether, and get by instead on smell, and on feeling the faintest shift in the water around them. Others kept their eyes and simply made them enormous, sensitive enough to catch 100 times more light than yours or mine ever could. There is a certain protein in the eye, useful for seeing in dim places, and where most creatures make do with one copy of the gene behind it. A few of these fish carry several. One small fish, called the silver spiny fin, carries 38 copies of it, which does seem, even by nature's usual excess, like rather a lot of insurance for one small pair of eyes. More than half Of all deep-sea fish, along with some of the shrimp and squid keeping them company, can make their own light. It is a gentle kind of glow, produced in little organs dotted with light-making cells, some fitted with tiny lenses, like a candle behind glass. It costs the creature almost nothing to produce, barely a whisper of its energy, and yet it does so much. Draws in a meal, marks out a bit of territory, calls out to a mate somewhere in all that black, or dazzles a predator just long enough to slip away unseen. Some, hovering in the twilight zone where a trace of light still falls from above, light up their own bellies to match it exactly, erasing their shadow entirely, so that nothing looking up from below ever notices them passing over. A quiet little trick, and a rather elegant one at that. The shape of these fish softens the deeper they live. Most surface fish carry a little pocket of gas to keep themselves afloat, but that pocket does no good under this much pressure. So the deep-sea kind mostly do without it, relying instead on fat, and on bones grown thin and light, and on flesh that holds far more water than muscle. The deeper you go, the more the fish themselves seem made of jelly rather than sinew. It slows them down, admittedly. No deep-sea fish will win any races, but down here nobody is running anywhere in particular. And because a proper meal might not come round again for a good long while, these fish take what they can get, however it arrives. Enormous mouths, jaws that unhook and stretch open wider than seems entirely fair. Stomachs that swell out to take in a fish bigger than themselves. It is not greed, exactly. It is simply prudence, in a house where supper is never guaranteed twice. Mesopelagic fish. This is the twilight floor, somewhere between 200 and 1,000 meters down, where the last thin trace of daylight fades slowly into nothing, and the water cools through a chill some 10 to 20 degrees wide. Most who live here are small and gentle enough, filter feeders who rise up every single night into the warmer waters above to feed, then sink back down before morning to hide from whatever might be hunting up there in daylight. That nightly rising and sinking is so vast, so widespread, that it once fooled the Navy itself. Sonar men during the war kept finding what looked like a second seafloor, one that rose and fell with the hours, shallower by night, deeper by day, and it turned out to be nothing more than millions of small fish, their little swim bladders bouncing the signal straight back. They named it the deep scattering layer, and it goes on still every night, the largest migration on the whole planet, and hardly a soul above the water ever notices it happening. It is no small effort either. Filling that swim bladder against all this pressure takes real energy, and the fish must mind it carefully on the way up, or risk it bursting entirely before they reach the surface. Some of them cross a temperature swing wide enough to leave you shivering twice over in a single night. First cold, then merely chilly, and back again by morning. These fish are, by deep-sea standards, rather well put together. Proper muscle, proper bone, working scales, decent hearts and kidneys, considerably more polish than what waits further down. Many carried tubular eyes, tall lenses fixed permanently upward, sacrificing any view to the sides in exchange for catching the faintest silhouette passing above them. It is rather like walking through life only ever looking at the ceiling. Though, in fairness, down here, the ceiling is where all the interesting business happens. Color serves the same purpose it always has, which is hiding. The lie-in-wait hunters wear black, or a deep dark red that might as well be black this far down, since red light cannot reach this deep at all. The travelers wear silver, countershaded, and many flash a soft glow along their bellies to erase their own outline from anyone watching from beneath. A few clever hunters have even grown yellow lenses, filtering out the ordinary light while still letting that telltale red glow through, a private little frequency all their own. One curious fellow, the brown snout spookfish, does something no other creature with a backbone manages. It focuses part of its sight not with a lens at all, but with a mirror tucked inside its own eye, which is either a marvelous bit of engineering or evolution simply showing off. And of all the residents on this floor, one small fish outnumbers the rest by such a margin it deserves a story of its own later on. Even the great big-eyed tuna, a creature that ordinarily prefers the sunlit water, will dive 500 meters down chasing that crowd, because everyone, it seems, eventually finds their way to where the food is. A few more characters are worth a mention before we move along. The stoplight loose jaw carries a lower jaw a quarter the length of its whole body, hinged loose with no floor to it at all, and glows with a red light that most of its prey cannot even see coming. The long-snouted lancetfish grows to a full 2 meters, a giant by these standards, and the dagger-tooth stops its prey cold the moment its teeth make contact. Not the gentlest of neighbors, any of them, but then few are this far down. Bathypelagic fish. Past the twilight, the last of the light gives out entirely, and you enter the midnight floor, stretching from 1,000 meters down to wherever the bottom finally is, colder than a stone step in December, 1 to 4 degrees, and dark in a way that has no exceptions. Down here, the whole pace of life shifts. Where the fish above are always rising and sinking, always somewhere to be, the fish of the midnight floor have settled into a kind of patient stillness, slow metabolisms, simple appetites, a willingness to eat whatever drifts close enough rather than waste a single ounce of energy chasing it down. It is the difference between a busy soul darting between floors all night and an old fellow parked quietly in one spot, content to let the evening come to him. The usual crowd here includes small bristlemouths and anglerfish, along with fangtooth, viperfish, daggertooth, and barracuda, most no bigger than your palm, few longer than your forearm. Food is desperately thin on the ground. Only a fifth of what falls from the surface even makes it as far as the twilight floor above, and only about 1/20th of that trickles further down to here. These are creatures living, quite literally, on the leftovers of the leftovers. Their bodies show it plainly. Long, watery, softly muscled, with hardly any bone left to speak of, so waterlogged that the crushing weight above barely troubles them, there being so little solid left in them to crush. Jaws hinge open wide, teeth curve inward to hold what they catch, scales are absent, skin runs slick, Eyes often see little or nothing at all, and the hearts and gills and kidneys have shrunk down to the barest minimum required to keep going. It is, in truth, very much the same shape a fish larva takes, which suggests these creatures simply never finished growing up, staying young their whole lives as a rather clever shortcut around all that wasted effort. There is always an exception to prove the rule cheeky enough to break it. The Yokozuna slickhead, only properly described in 2021, stretches past 2.5 meters, the largest fully midnight-dwelling bony fish known, a great gentle giant among a floor otherwise crowded with creatures the size of a teacup. Finding a mate down here, in the dark, with hardly another soul for miles, takes its own kind of ingenuity. Some glow in patterns particular to their own kind, a signature in the dark. Others simply carry both sexes within themselves, doubling their luck whenever a stranger does happen by. But it is the anglerfish who take the prize for the strangest solution the sea has ever come up with. The female releases a scent to draw in a much smaller male, and once he finds her, he bites down and never lets go again. In some kinds, an enzyme dissolves the very point where they touch until their two bloodstreams run as one, and the male slowly withers down to little more than a small, attached pair of gonads, kept close and ready for whenever she is prepared to spawn. It is either the most devoted marriage in all the ocean or the strangest one, and perhaps being honest, it is both at once. A couple more worth a mention. The pelican eel scoops up its prey with a mouth like an open net, a small glowing lure lit at the tip of its tail, and the black swallower, true to its name, can take in another fish 10 times its own weight, thanks to a stomach that stretches further than good sense would ever recommend. Adaptation to high pressure. Let us slow down a moment and look closer at how any of this holds together at all, because the numbers involved are worth turning over slowly. Pressure builds by roughly 1 atmosphere for every 10 meters you sink. So a fish resting at the very bottom of the midnight floor carries something near 400 atmospheres pressing in from every side. 400 times what settles gently on your own shoulders this very moment. At the smallest scale, that pressure decides which chemical reactions can even take place. Any reaction that would expand in volume gets squeezed shut before it starts, while ones that shrink in volume are, if anything, encouraged along. So these fish have quietly rebuilt their whole inner chemistry around reactions that contract rather than expand. And the proteins doing the heavy lifting have grown sturdier, tighter bonds holding firm where a looser structure would simply give way under all that weight. Their cell walls face much the same trouble, losing their softness as the pressure packs everything too closely together. The fix, again, is much the same trick as before. A little more of the loose, unsaturated fat worked into the walls, just enough give kept in reserve to keep the whole thing supple rather than stiff. Some 200 known kinds, scattered across 10 orders and 13 families, have taken the idea a step further still, growing a soft, jelly-like layer beneath the skin or along the spine, easing their buoyancy, cutting the cost of growing larger, and smoothing their passage through the water with less drag to fight against. There is a curious echo of all this elsewhere in nature. The proteins in these fish hold up to heat about as well as those found in desert lizards, baking under a fierce sun. Proof that a sturdy structure once evolved seems to serve equally well whether the extreme pressing in is bone-crushing cold water or blistering desert air. One particular enzyme, important for keeping salt and water in balance within the cells, shows this tuning rather beautifully. A fish living at 2,000 meters and a close cousin living twice as deep carry two different versions of it, and the deeper dweller's copy shrugs off pressure that would trouble the shallower one considerably. Evolution quietly adjusting the same small machinery, floor by floor, to suit whichever depth a creature happens to call home. Lanternfish. If any single fish could be said to run this whole dark house, it would be this one. Lanternfish make up as much as 65% of all deep-sea fish by weight, which is a staggering share for a creature most people will never see or hear of in their lives. All told, their global weight comes to somewhere between 550 and 660 million tons, several times over everything every fishing fleet on Earth hauls up in a year. And they simply go on, quietly, in the dark, entirely unbothered by any of it. They are the ones chiefly behind that great nightly rising and sinking we spoke of earlier, up to feed, down to hide, an entire ocean's worth of small lives running the same shift, over and over, without complaint. In the Southern Ocean particularly, they serve as a fallback meal for squid and king penguins whenever krill runs short, quietly propping up half the food chain from below without anyone above the water much noticing. And despite there being more of them than nearly anything else that swims, fishing for them remains modest. A few small operations off South Africa, in the sub-Antarctic, and in the Gulf of Oman. An enormous patient abundance, largely left well alone. Endangered species. Not every tale from down here ends gently, mind. A study in 2006 by Canadian researchers found 5 kinds of deep-sea fish, the blue hake and spiny eel among them, edging toward disappearing altogether. It was not some shift in the water or the cold that did it. It was fishing itself, creeping further out from the shallower shelves and down onto the slopes beyond them, chasing catch to depths of 1,600 meters and more. The trouble runs deeper than the fishing alone. These fish take about as long to grow up and be ready to breed as a person does, an extraordinarily slow clock for something living in the sea. And that slowness means a population, once thinned out too far, has precious little chance of filling back in again within any useful stretch of time. And so we are left with a rather uneven little tale to close on. A house that took the better part of 100 million years to become fit to live in, filled with creatures whose sight, their chemistry, even their manner of finding love, was shaped with extraordinary patience to survive the cold and the crushing dark. And all of it, given only a few decades of pressure from above the water, from us, can be worn thin rather more quickly than it was ever built. The deep sea managed to adapt to almost everything the ocean could throw at it. It has had precious little time yet to adapt to us. And with a bit of luck. Come back down with me a while longer. There is more of that old dark house we have not yet walked through. More rooms, more quiet residents, and plenty of them worth meeting properly before the night is through. Neighbors of the deep. Before we go any further, it is worth knowing just how rare a thing it is to live out here at all. Of every kind of creature known to swim in the sea, only about 2 in every 100 choose to spend their lives drifting in open water, out past the shelter of any seafloor, rather than resting on the bottom or tucked into it. 2%, a small, strange fellowship, and the fish we have been speaking of belong to it. The lanternfish, as we have already heard, is by far the most common face among them, but it keeps company with a good many other odd characters. The flashlight fish, which carries its own little lamp beneath one eye. The cookie-cutter shark, small and unassuming, yet capable of taking a perfectly round bite from something far larger than itself, the way you might take a bite from an apple, and moving on without further comment. The bristlemouths, the anglerfish, the viper fish, even a few quiet eel pouts tucked into the cold. A whole society of neighbors, most of whom will never once see daylight in their lives, nor miss it. And it helps, too, to know the house has more than one deep floor. What we have been calling the midnight floor is properly split in 2. The upper section, called Bathypelagic, runs from 1 kilometer down to about 4 kilometers. Below that lies the Mesopelagic, deeper still down to 6 kilometers, colder and darker again, if such a thing were possible. The house, it turns out, goes down rather further than most of us ever imagine. Beginnings. Every resident of this house was once something much smaller and much more helpless, and that beginning is worth pausing over. Some of these fish are born and spend their whole lives in the deep. Others begin their story nearer the surface in shallower, gentler water, only sinking down to the depths once they have grown enough to manage it. But whichever way it starts, the eggs and the tiny larvae that hatch from them share the same simple problem. They must drift. They have no fins worth the name yet, no strength to swim against anything, so they are carried wherever the water takes them. And to do that safely, they must neither sink like a stone nor rise like a bubble. They must hang, weightless, in perfect balance. Nature's answer is a small droplet of oil, tucked into the fluid of the egg itself, light enough to hold the whole tiny creature suspended in the water column, neither up nor down, simply there, drifting, waiting to grow. Growing up changes the arithmetic entirely. Water, being what it is, tends to push most solid things upward, an effect we call upthrust, and most living tissue is a touch denser than the water around it, which is why a body left to itself would slowly sink. To settle into a comfortable place in the water, a creature must find its own particular balance between the two, neither fighting the water nor surrendering to it. Most fish nearer the surface solve this with a small pocket of gas inside them, a swim bladder. But, as we have heard, that pocket serves poorly once the pressure grows too great. So many of the deeper dwellers do without it altogether, relying instead on shapes not unlike a bird's wing turned sideways, built to catch a little lift from the water itself as they move through it. The same idea that keeps a soaring gull aloft, borrowed quietly by a fish that will never once see the sky. The gulper eel carries its own particular answer to a different problem entirely, that of finding a meal in the first place, with a long, thin feeler trailing out from its body to search the water ahead of it, feeling for whatever might be worth catching or worth attracting. Life without a bladder. It is worth lingering a little longer on this business of the swim bladder, because the deep sea handles it so differently floor by floor. Down on the seafloor itself, in what is called the benthic zone, and just above it, in the Bathypelagic, life looks rather different again from the drifting world above. Rat-tails and brotulas are especially common along the bottom, joined by flatfish, hagfish, eel-pout, green-eye eels, stingrays, lumpfish, and the strange, flattened batfish, all going about their business along the seabed itself, rather than out in open water. And here is a curious detail that took naturalists a good while to notice. Fish with proper spiny fins, the kind common almost everywhere else in the sea, are remarkably rare down here. The few that do turn up mostly belong to two old and rather ancient orders, one of them home to fish like the modern-day roughies, the other to the strange ribbon-shaped oarfish and their relations. It is thought this scarcity tells its own quiet story, that the deep sea has belonged to older lineages for so long, and those lineages adapted so completely to the place that newer, more modern kinds of fish have simply never managed to muscle their way in. Most of the open-water deep-sea fish belong to their own separate orders entirely, found nowhere else, while the bottom-dwelling kinds tend to share their family tree with shallow-water cousins. Two very different histories, unfolding on two different floors of the very same building. The ambush specialists. A few particular hunters deserve a proper introduction, rather than a passing mention. The saber-tooth fish waits in the twilight water, with its eyes turned upward like a pair of small telescopes, watching for the faint outline of anything passing above it against what little light remains, and its teeth curve backward, so that whatever it catches finds no way of backing itself out again. The Antarctic toothfish carries much the same trick. Large eyes angled upward, built for exactly this purpose, spotting a shadow rather than a shape. Down in the deeper dark, the humpback anglerfish waits with a small glowing lure held out before it, patient as stone, and when something curious enough drifts close to investigate, the fish opens its mouth and draws in a great rush of water all at once, prey and all, swallowing something larger than itself as easily as breathing. The bristle mouths, though small and rarely noticed, may in fact be the most numerous backboned creatures on the entire planet. A whole vast quiet population of ambush hunters scattered right across the world's oceans, each one content to sit and wait rather than chase. Strange lives. A few residents live lives so odd they are worth telling as their own small stories. The flabby whalefish begins its life bright red small, rising up each night into the lower twilight water to feed on tiny drifting copepods, much like any other youngster finding its feet. But when a young male finally becomes an adult, something rather remarkable happens. His liver swells enormous, and then his jaws fuse shut permanently, and he simply stops eating altogether for the rest of his life, living instead off the great reserve of energy stored away in that one oversized organ. It is a strange kind of adulthood, trading away the ability to ever eat again in exchange for whatever time is left. The Sloane's viperfish takes the opposite path, making its own nightly journey up from the crushing dark of the midnight floor all the way to water near the very surface and back down again before morning, a commute every bit as demanding as the ones made by its smaller mesopelagic neighbors, undertaken by a fish built for a much deeper, stiller sort of life. And down at the very bottom of the known world, past 7,000 meters, where almost nothing at all is thought to survive, two small fish break every rule we have just described. A pale cusk eel and a rough little grenadier, both found at depths beyond 7 kilometers, still carry fully working swim bladders, still hold on to proper dense bone and strong jaws, when every expectation says they ought to have given all that up long before reaching such a depth. It seems that even the rules of the deep have their exceptions, tucked away in the very deepest, least visited corners of the house. Neighbors without fins fish are far from the only residents of the midnight floor. Squid drift there too, and octopuses and enormous whales passing through on journeys of their own. Sponges cling patiently to what solid ground there is. Old, simple creatures called brachiopods sit quietly on the bottom, along with sea stars and their spiny, round-bodied relatives, the echinoids. It is a full and busy household, in its own slow way, even if fish themselves find the going rather harder than most of their neighbors do. Senses in the dark. With sight so often useless this far down, other senses take on far greater weight. The inner ear, tuned to catch the faintest sound traveling through water, becomes one of the most trusted senses many of these fish possess. Alongside it runs the lateral line, a thin thread of sensitivity running the length of the body, alert to the smallest shift in the pressure of the water around it, enough to sense another creature moving nearby without ever seeing it at all. And smell carries its own particular importance too, especially for the males of certain species, who must find a female somewhere out in all that black, using scent alone, drifting toward her on nothing more than the faintest trace carried through the water. The chemistry of cold and pressure. We spoke earlier of how these fish hold themselves together against the pressure. There is a little more to that story worth telling slowly, by the fire, so to speak. Deep-sea creatures tend to favor chemical reactions that quietly shrink rather than expand, since pressure always sides against anything trying to take up more room. Their bodies show measurably smaller shifts in the deeper properties of chemistry, the kind chemists call entropy and enthalpy, than creatures living nearer the surface. A sign of a system that has learned to change as little as possible while still getting the necessary work done. Even the small proteins that give muscle its strength, particularly one called actin, have folded themselves into a sturdier, more compact shape than the same protein wears in a surface fish. A shape that happens to make it remarkably resistant to heat as well as pressure, echoing again those same tough proteins found in lizards baking under a desert sun. Two entirely different worlds, cold crushing water and dry blistering sand. And evolution, it seems, reached for the very same solution in both. One particular enzyme illustrates this tuning especially well. It sits in the gills, quietly managing the balance of salt and water within the cells. Ordinary work, done everywhere, in every fish. But the deep-sea versions of this enzyme have grown far less troubled by pressure than their shallow water cousins. And the effect only grows stronger the deeper a fish lives. Compare two close relatives, one settled around 2,000 meters down, the other twice as deep again in what is properly called the hadal zone, further down than almost anything else on Earth bothers to go. And the deeper of the two carries, the steadier, more pressure-tolerant version by a considerable margin. It is a small, quiet piece of evidence for something rather large, that evolution has been adjusting this machinery with real precision, floor by floor, for longer than most of the house's other inhabitants have even existed. And that for tonight is as far down as we shall go. The house does not end here, of course. It never really ends, not properly. Not for anyone who has only an evening to spend wandering through it. But perhaps that is enough for now. Enough dark water, enough quiet old residents, enough strange little lives lived out entirely beyond the reach of any light at all. Rest easy. Somewhere far below the tide turns. The snow keeps falling, and none of it needs you to be awake to keep going.